As you know, Thanksgiving is the time of year. It's a national holiday, but it's really a Christian holiday. It goes back to the time of the Pilgrims. And I want to read to you a little bit from something that was written by one of the passengers on the Mayflower in 1620. And this particular person's name is Robert Cushman. And he was on the Mayflower, and he wasn't too hopeful about how things were going to go. It wasn't necessarily a pleasant voyage on the Mayflower, and he wrote about it during his time of despair. And this is what he said: "If we ever make a plantation in New England, God works a miracle, especially considering how scant we shall be of victuals, and worst of all, ununited amongst ourselves." So as you can see from the get-go, not only were they running out of food and they didn't know where they were going to get their food from, they all were in disagreement about how they were going to make all this work. Okay, it sounds like a church, doesn't it? Okay. He says, "If I should write you of all the things that foretell our ruin, I should overcharge my weak head and grieve your tender heart. Only this I pray you, prepare for evil tidings of us every day. I see not in reason how we can escape. Pray for us instantly." Now, this was his warning, his letter going out while they were on the voyage, on the Mayflower. He was sort of like forecasting his anticipated doom. Of course, we know that it didn't end that way. They did arrive, and God brought them to their destination, and they were able to establish, through God's help, a home in the wilderness. And later on, of course, you know the story of how Thanksgiving emerged in celebration for what God had done for them. The harvest was successful, they had food, and they were able to celebrate that. And that's certainly something to be thankful for when God provides you, when you don't know where it's coming from. And certainly that was true of them. What I'd like us to focus a little bit on this morning is on ways to be thankful. Ways to be thankful ceaselessly every day, because really celebrating Thanksgiving one day a year is not good enough. It's not good enough for us as Christians, because we believe that God is the provider of all good things. The Bible tells us that every good and perfect gift comes from above. And so we need to be mindful of how we can be thankful even when we don't feel like being thankful. We're not the first ones who have struggled with that. The Jews had a problem with that. I mean, think about it. We take for granted the fact that we have Bibles, probably several Bibles, in our homes. In the time of Jesus, and even preceding that, among the Jews, they did not have a Bible in their home. They just didn't have it. If you wanted to know anything about the scriptures, you had to go to the synagogue or the temple to hear the scriptures read. And as you know, young Jewish boys who grew up in the time of Jesus memorized large portions of the Old Testament. That was their Bible, the Old Testament. They memorized large portions of it. So that's the way that they had their Bible, through memorization, you see. And I like to go back. I'd like to go back a little bit to the time of Jesus and talk about some of the customs that existed back then. Now, I don't do this because I think we need to become Jewish or anything like that, but rather I think it helps us to better follow Jesus' example, to be more like Jesus. And there is a Jewish practice that I think we could all benefit from. And it's adopting a particular type of Jewish prayer habit that I think can help us to grow in Christ and help us to become more thankful and joyful people. That's what we need. It was something that has been used for thousands of years, even preceding the time of Jesus. Jesus himself would have learned about it as well. So what is this style of prayer that I'm talking about? Well, it's the habit of blessing the Lord. It's the habit of blessing the Lord. Now, when you first hear that, you might think that sounds a little bit strange. Blessing the Lord? I thought the Lord blesses us. That's the way we're prone to hear the word bless being used today. In fact, if you go down here to the end of the road, to the Country Folk Superstore, is it still called that? Okay. More than likely when you check out there, someone there is going to say to you, have a blessed day. Or when you go to the grocery store, if you actually get a cashier at the checkout who is, in my thinking, they're probably a believer when they say this to you, have a blessed day, right? And what does that mean? Well, we tend to think it means blessings will come upon us. They're wishing God's blessing upon us. So what is this idea about blessing the Lord? Where does this come from? This was something that's in the Bible, and we're going to look at a couple passages that talk about it, but it's also something that should be a habit in our daily lives, to bless the Lord, to bless him. It's actually an attitude of continual thanksgiving towards God that expresses that attitude through brief prayers that essentially acknowledge him as the source of every good thing that we have. In fact, it ultimately comes from Moses. Moses started this whole thing. We go back to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Moses is speaking to the children of Israel in one of his important addresses. And in Deuteronomy 8, verses 10 through 11, he's admonishing them not to forget the Lord. And this is what he says to them. When you have eaten and are satisfied, you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. And then he goes on to say, beware that you do not forget the Lord your God. You see the connection there? He says you need to bless the Lord because of what has come about, the bounty of the land. And he says the reason you need to do this is so that you don't forget where it came from. You don't forget the Lord. Now, it seems like it's easy, for the most part, to think about our reliance upon God when we're going through difficult times. It seems as if we tend to look up when that happens. I had a professor in seminary who used to say that when you're on your back, the only place to look is straight up. And it seems like that's the case. When things are going bad, that's when we tend to cry out for God and we tend to focus more on God. It's very easy to forget God when things are going well, isn't it? When things go well, when things are prospering. And for the Jews, that's what happened to them. When they began to prosper in the promised land, that is when they began to forget about the Lord. And the cure for this, that the rabbis and the rabbinic tradition tried to put together based upon Moses' command, was that they should continually remind themselves by blessing the Lord for the things that God has given them, by uttering these short prayers of thanks to bless the Lord. And so this continual prayer kept them mindful of God's ever-presence in his love. We were talking on Tuesday night in our Bible study about an attribute of God called God's omnipresence. We had a very fun and fascinating discussion about that. We talked about the actual meaning of God's omnipresence, that God is fully present everywhere. Think about that. He's fully present everywhere. It's not like you and I. We can only be present in one place at a time. But God can be completely and fully present everywhere, all the time. There's no place, David says in the Psalms, where I can escape God's presence. It doesn't matter where I go, how deep I go, how high I go, I can never get away from it. Now that can be good and it can be bad, depending on if you want to escape God's presence or be in God's presence. The reality is that sometimes we think we can get away with things. We cannot, because God is always present. But even when it feels like God isn't present, he still is. He still is. And the good thing about that is the fact that God is love. That means his love is always present. Even when we don't feel like it is, it's still there. He is still always there for us. So this continual prayer to be reminded that God is always present and that we should lift up a praise to him, because that's what it means to bless the Lord, is a prayer of thanksgiving, of praise to God for what he has done for us, is always to be on our minds to keep us attentive to that reality, that God is always present. He's always caring for us. He's always loving us. And I suspect this is what the Apostle Paul had in mind as well. He wrote in 1 Thessalonians 5, "Be joyful always, pray continually, and give thanks in all circumstances." Notice how he weaves those things together. Be joyful always, pray continually, and give thanks in all circumstances. You see, I think Paul had this same idea in mind as well. Now, this was a practice that existed before the time of Jesus. It essentially worked itself out in a number of short blessings that were taught in the synagogues to young Jewish boys and girls. And these little short prayers were supposed to be used at different occasions, at different times. And these are actually still used today in Jewish synagogues, believe it or not. A lot of these have been recorded in the Mishnah, and they still practice them today. For example, in the daily synagogue service, it always begins with this particular blessing. It says, "Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, King of the universe." You see, what does that remind you of? It reminds you that we are to recognize that God is in control of everything, that he's sovereign over the universe. So the idea here is not to bless objects or to bless people. That's our usual sense that we think of, like when the cashier says, "Have a blessed day." But rather, it's to bless the Lord. It's to aim that blessing to the Lord with the understanding we're focusing on him as the source of all things, the source of all goodness. The word bless itself comes from a Hebrew word. It's the Hebrew word barak. And it carries with it this idea to kneel. So essentially what's being suggested here is that when we bless God, we are mentally bowing to him and worshiping him as the author, as the creator, as the sustainer of all things, you see. So mentally bowing to God is the idea behind blessing the Lord. And now, Jesus himself used this in the scripture. Sometimes translations don't get this right, but in the gospel, when Jesus is conducting the Last Supper with his disciples, we're told that Jesus took bread, and it says, and he blessed. Now, some translations will say he blessed it. The word "it" is not in the Greek. It's not there. That gives the suggestion that he's blessing the bread. But that's not what he's doing at all. What he's doing is he's saying one of the blessings that Jews would say before they would eat. It was one of those blessings that was aimed at the Lord. Okay? Why? Because if you think about it, if you got food in front of you, you've already been blessed, right? So why would you ask God to add another blessing to it? That's always puzzled me, by the way. Why do we ask God to bless the food we're about to eat? We've already been blessed with it. Shouldn't we bless God? Shouldn't we thank God for the food? What more do you want God to do to that food? Unless you're eating a bacon double cheeseburger and you want God to miraculously change it so that it doesn't clog your arteries or something. I don't know what you want God to do when you're asking him to bless that food. But here is more than likely the words that Jesus uttered when he gave that blessing, because this was recorded in the Mishnah. "Blessed is he who brings forth bread from the earth." I would suggest to you that's what Jesus did when it says that he blessed. He gave a blessing to God in the tradition of the Jews. Blessed is he who brings forth bread from the earth. It's also the case that when miracles occurred, when Jesus did miracles, the people would glorify God. It says that they would bless God and glorify him. What would they say? More than likely, they would say this blessing. Blessed is he who has performed a miracle in this place. Acknowledging God as the one who's performed a miracle. Blessed is he who has performed a miracle in this place. This was quite customary in the time to pray that blessing at the site where a miracle occurred. And so we have an interesting story, and I want us to look at this briefly, in the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 17. Look at this with me. Luke 17, beginning in verse 12. You know the story. It's a great story. Verse 12, as he was entering a village, he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance. This was because by law, that's how they had to stand at a distance. Okay, couldn't get close to people. And lifted up their voices saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. When he saw them, he said to them, go and show yourselves to the priests. And as they went, they were cleansed. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. Praising God with a loud voice. It doesn't tell us what he said, but I guarantee you he was saying the ritual blessing. And he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. I love this next line. Now he was a Samaritan. Now he was a Samaritan. Why does Luke want us to know that? Well, I think it's one of those sticking the knife and twisting it into the Jewish listeners at the time. Remember, they didn't like Samaritans. They didn't like Samaritans at all. But this, the only one out of the group who comes back to give thanks is a Samaritan. And Jesus says, we're not all 10 cleansed. Where are the 9? Where are the 9? So here we have another example of someone giving a blessing, of someone praising God for what has been done on his behalf. So everything has a blessing for it, according to this Jewish practice. In Psalm 24, verse 1, we get this idea. It reads this way. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. We get everything we have from the earth. It comes from the earth. But who does the earth belong to? The Lord. So I did all the work to get it from the earth. No, well, yeah, maybe. But remember, God gives you the ability to do this. You're still mining it from God as the source of this. And since everything belongs to the Lord, the rabbis of Jesus' day and even earlier decided that everything that we enjoy in life should cause us to bless God for it. In fact, in the Mishnah, as I mentioned earlier, we have a record of rabbinic thought about this from Jesus' time until about 200 AD, from a little before Jesus' time to 200 AD. And the first book of the Mishnah is a book that's completely devoted to blessings, the different types of blessings that should be offered at different occasions. So it's just fascinating to me that they don't have any personal pronouns in them. There are no personal pronouns in those blessings. What does that mean? The focus should not be on you. It should be on God. It should be on God. That's what the emphasis is on. A person was supposed to devote all of their thoughts upon wakening in the morning to praising God for each part of the body that's functioning. I mean, these are the kinds of blessings that they had, right? We take these for granted until we have a problem with them, don't we? We take it for granted that everything's working in the morning when you wake up. But the Mishnah has a blessing for every part of the body when you wake up that you're supposed to say. So the first thing in the first century, the first thing that you would do in the morning when you wake up is say this blessing. Blessed, And of course, back then, what was the first thing you heard that would wake you up in the morning? Hear the rooster crowing, right? All right, so this is the blessing. Blessed is he who is given to the cock understanding to distinguish between day and night. That was the blessing that you would say, okay? And so when they opened up their eyes in the morning, they would say, blessed is he who opens the eyes of the blind. And when they dressed, they would say, blessed is he who clothes the naked. They would always say that as well when they received a new piece of clothing, before they would put it on. When they would experience nature, they would also bless God. When the flowers began to bloom in the spring and the trees began to bud, this is what they would say. Blessed is he who did not omit anything from the world and created within it good creations and good trees for people to enjoy. And after a long cold winter, that's a great thing. So when you see that, what should be the first response you should have when you see things blooming in the spring? You should bless God. Bless God for it. When they would hear thunder, what would they do? Well, they would say a blessing. Blessed is he whose strength and power fills the world. And when it rained, they would say, blessed is he who is good and gives good things. Now, I don't know about you, but yesterday I wasn't thinking about blessing God for the rain. It was a miserable day. Maybe I need some help on that one. But if you lived in the ancient Near East, where rain was scarce, when it would rain, you would bless God and praise him for the goodness that he would bring. Because after it would rain, things would turn green. Things would bloom and bud. And it was a welcome relief from the heat and the desert conditions that you would experience more often than anything else. Water was a scarce commodity. And when we think about our abundant food here, and we all are going to be eating quite heavily this week, I know. But when we think about that, we need to remember that it is all dependent upon the rain that God has provided. And we need to be thankful for that. There's also blessings for life seasons, for the highs and lows in life. They had blessings for all these things. When they went through a long, difficult time and finally found relief, or they celebrated a happy event that they had been waiting for, this is the blessing they would say. Blessed is he who has allowed us to live and sustained us and enabled us to reach this day. Enabled us to reach this day. You can see that would be a welcome thing. When a son returned home from war, or when a baby was born, or when some other wonderful thing would happen, they would also utter that prayer as a praise to God for allowing them to see that day when this great thing has occurred, has come about. Even in times of grief, when someone died or when they heard tragic news, they would bless God. Now that might sound a bit strange, but listen to the blessing. Blessed is he who is the true judge. Blessed is he who is the true judge. Now what is that? It's a reminder that God was still good, and when they heard about tragic events, that he will ultimately bring justice even when it doesn't seem like justice can be found. They knew they could count on God to make things right, you see. And that's something that we need to keep in mind as well, don't you think? When the bad stuff comes crashing down on us, when we look around and we wonder, where is God in the midst of this? Bless God and thank him that he is the true judge. And even though we may not see it right now, God is going to be found faithful for bringing about his good ends. So we ought to remember God's kindness to us, because it is constant. It is every day. It's easy to start worrying that God is not in control and not remember that he is continually being faithful to us by being ever present to us and that he sustains us every minute of the day. David recognized that. And in Psalm 103, he shared his secret of how we can keep God's loving care on our minds. This is what he wrote. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits, who forgives all your iniquity, who heals your diseases, who redeems your life from the pit, who crowns you with steadfast love and mercy, who satisfies you with good as long as you live, so that your youth is renewed like eagles. My friends, we have much to be thankful for. Let's not forget to utter those prayers of thanksgiving to God. And now, I want to take time, and I'm going to come down there. We're not going to mic this or anything, but I would like to invite you to tell us about, as a community of like-minded believers, to tell us how we can rejoice and give praise with you to God for things that he has done for you. So I'm going to step down right now, and that's what we're going to do.